I was at a small estate auction recently, watching a man get into a fierce bidding war over a framed 1917 Liberty Bond poster. When he finally won, he was practically glowing, holding it up like a holy relic. To him, it wasn't just paper. It was a symbol of pure, heroic sacrifice. He kept talking about how the people stepped up to save the world and how that poster represented the soul of the nation. But then the auctioneer handed him a companion piece that came with a lot, a dull, leather-bound bank ledger from the same year. As the man flipped through the brittle pages, his expression completely changed. He stopped talking about sacrifice and started squinting at the numbers. He realized he wasn't looking at a history of bravery. He was looking at a high-interest invoice. The ledger showed that for every soldier charging over a trench, there was a specific entry in a Manhattan office detailing exactly how much interest was being compounded on the loans that paid for their rifles. That sudden shift in his eyes, the moment the glory of the poster met the cold, hard math of the ledger, revealed a truth most history books skip over. We are taught to think of World War I in terms of mud, blood, and bullets. But if you look at the ledgers instead of the medals, a different story emerges. It turns out the most devastating weapon used between 1914 and 1918 wasn't the tank or the machine gun, it was the ink in a banker's pen. It was a game where the real winners never stepped foot in a trench, and the bill for the victory was passed down to people who weren't even born yet. The battlefield has changed over the last century, but the financial machinery behind it hasn't. Whether it's 1914 or today, the reality remains the same. Wars are always financed first and fought second. You know, I've been sitting with that story about the auction for a few days now. It's just really unsettling. We have this romanticized version of history, the war to end all wars, all the heroism, the sacrifice. And then you open a book like that ledger and it's just, math. Cold compounding interest.
It creates a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance, doesn't it? Because on one hand, you have the human story, which is absolutely real. The suffering in the trenches was real. The bravery was real. But then you have the accounting story. And the accounting story doesn't care about patriotism. It doesn't care about sacrifice. It cares about solvency. It cares about yield. And as we dig into the stack of documents we have for today, the argument emerging is that the accounting story is actually the one that shaped the world we live in now.
That's the part that really surprised me. You know, going through these sources, we usually talk about World War I as this big geopolitical explosion. The Archduke gets shot, all the alliances trigger, and boom, the world's at war.
Right. Fact.
Yeah, in fact. But the material we're looking at today, I mean, financial histories of the German banking system, private letters from J.P. Morgan, analysis of the Federal Reserve's early days, they paint a completely different picture. They suggest 1914 wasn't just a war, it was a bailout, a financial rescue operation.
A reset, to use the term from the economic literature we've been looking at. And I think to really get why that matters to you, the listener, right now, we have to strip away all that sepia-toned nostalgia. Okay. The mission of this deep dive is to open up that hidden ledger. We need to figure out how the war was actually paid for, why the banking system needed a war to avoid collapsing in 1913, and this is the really wild part. How this specific 4-year period might have permanently screwed up our relationship with energy and technology.
And maybe even how we record history itself. I have to warn you, some of this is going to sound, well, it seriously challenges the timeline I learned in high school.
Yeah.
But we aren't here to just recite dates and battles. We're here to look at the mechanics.
Exactly. We're looking at the engine room, not the paint job on the ship.
Before we get into the heavy stuff, the Federal Reserve and these German loan bureaus, I want to ground this because macroeconomics can feel very abstract, you know. Yeah. But for the people living through it, it was visceral. I found this account in our source material about an elderly clerk named Arthur. He worked in the city of London, right in the heart of the financial district, during August 1914. Okay. Arthur had spent 30 years of his life counting gold sovereigns. He described the physical sensation of the gold, the weight of it. To him, that weight was security. It meant the world was solid, promises were kept. If you had a sovereign, you had a real, tangible piece of the kingdom in your hand.
Something real.
Something real. Then the war is declared and the gold standard is suspended. Arthur described this chilling silence that fell over the bank. The shimmering heavy coins were taken away and replaced by crisp, ink-scented paper. He called them promises of value that felt as light as air. He watched as the old world, with its tangible wealth, was liquidated overnight. He saw ordinary families coming in, handing over their gold, thinking they were sacrificing for the king, not realizing they were handing over the keys to their own future.
They thought it was a patriotic duty.
Exactly. Arthur wrote about this quiet desperation he felt, realizing that the very ground beneath his feet was being converted into a ledger of debt. He realized his children's future labor had just been mortgaged to pay for a war they didn't start.
Powerful.
It's a heartbreaking image, isn't it? The silence in the bank, the realization that the money in your pocket has fundamentally changed its very nature.
That silence is the sound of the modern world being born. I mean it. That moment Arthur describes, trading the coin for the piece of paper, that is the pivotal moment of the 20th century.
So to understand why that happened, we have to back up. We can't just start with the war. We have to look at the banking system before the first shot was fired.
Absolutely.
Right, because the standard narrative is war starts, chaos ensues, banks get into trouble because of the war. But the sources are arguing the opposite.
They are arguing that the trouble was the precondition, the cause, not the effect.
Yeah.
If you look at the balance sheets of the major European banks, Deutsche Bank, the British banks, the French, in July 1914, they were, to quote one of the financial historians we read, dying from their own weight.
Dying from their own weight. What does that even mean in banking terms?
It means they were insolvent. Simple. Look at the data between 1870 and 1913. This was the golden age of empire, right? Colonialism, industrial expansion.
Right.
European banks grew their deposit bases, that's the money they owed to depositors like you and me, by roughly 400%. They were taking in money hand over fist.
Okay, so that sounds like a booming business. More deposits, more money.
It sounds great on the intake, but here's the catch. Look at the reserves. In that same period, their actual gold reserves only increased by about 80%.
So wait, for every $4 people put in, they only had about 80 cents of actual gold to back it up.
Less than that, even. They had built a massive inverted pyramid. They had promised to pay out 4 times more than they had the physical capacity to cover. And they had lent that money out on things that were becoming worthless.
Like what were they blowing the money on?
Oh, all sorts of imperial dreams. Colonial ventures in Africa that failed spectacularly. Railway projects in the Ottoman Empire that were never going to be finished. Massive speculation in South American mining.
So they have these assets on their books that are technically worth millions on paper.
On paper, yes,
Right.
but they were completely illiquid. You couldn't sell them. If everyone came to the bank on the same day and asked for their gold, the bank would have to say, sorry, we spent it on a railroad in Baghdad that doesn't actually exist yet.
So it's a classic bank run scenario just waiting to happen.
It wasn't just waiting, it was happening. This is the detail that just blows my mind every time I review these notes. By July of 1914, before the troops are mobilizing, the markets were frozen solid. The London Stock Exchange, the financial heart of the entire planet at the time, shut down.
The London Stock Exchange shut down.
And not for a bank holiday or a long weekend. It stayed closed for 5 months. 5 months. Can you imagine if the New York Stock Exchange just locked its doors today and said, see you in half a year?
The panic would be civil unrest.
Yeah.
People burning down the banks.
Yeah.
Total chaos.
The system was broken. There were runs on banks happening in 50 different countries simultaneously. We aren't just talking about a local dip in the market. This was a global liquidity drought. The entire machine had seized up.
And under the strict rules of the gold standard.
Under the rules they were supposed to be playing by, these banks were dead. They should have filed for bankruptcy. The board members should have been ruined. Their shareholders wiped out.
But they weren't. Because the war started.
Right. And this is where the cover story comes in. Look, I don't want to sound like we're wearing tinfoil hats here, implying the bankers shot the Archduke or something. But you have to look at the sheer convenience of the timing. The war provided the ultimate alibi. Suddenly, the fact that the banks couldn't pay their depositors wasn't because of 40 years of reckless, greedy gambling.
No, it was because of the emergency.
It was the emergency. It completely changes the framing. It's not, we lost your money. It's the Kaiser is attacking. We have to lock the vaults for national security. It's an act of patriotism, not an admission of failure.
And because it was an emergency, the governments could suspend the normal rules.
That's what Arthur saw from his desk. The government stepped in and said, okay, banks, you don't have to redeem paper for gold anymore. They scrapped the one single rule that kept the banks honest. And then government guarantees started flowing in. The war effectively converted private bank losses into public national debt.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of this. Because it's easy to just say they printed money, but how do they actually do it without people immediately realizing the money was worthless? You mentioned something in the notes about Germany, the Darlehenskassen.
The Darlehenskassen. The loan bureaus. This is a brilliant, and I mean brilliant, but devious piece of financial engineering. So Germany is in a bind. They need to fund a massive war. They don't have the gold.
And they can't raise taxes enough?
No, because that would turn the people against the war immediately. We want you to go die in a trench, and also we're taking half your income. It doesn't sell, so they need to borrow.
But who lends money to a country that's already effectively broke and is about to start the biggest war in history?
Their own people. But their people don't have cash. They have stuff. They own factories. They have stocks, corporate bonds, inventory in a warehouse.
Right.
So the government sets up these loan bureaus. Let's say you own a factory, you have a warehouse full of steel beams, or maybe a big stack of bonds from a company that's now failing. You can't buy bread with steel beams. They are illiquid.
Right. I can't walk into a bakery and slap a steel beam on the counter.
Exactly. So you take your steel beams or your dodgy bonds to the Darlingskassen. You mortgage them, and in return, the bureau gives you these new notes. Darlingskassenschein, loan bureau notes.
And these notes work like regular cash.
They look like cash. You can spend them at the shop. People accept them. But here is the trick, and this is where the real alchemy happens. The Central Bank of Germany, the Reichsbank, was legally allowed to count these new paper notes as part of their gold reserve.
I need to process that. You're telling me the bank takes a piece of paper that represents a steel beam?
Or a worthless bond, yes.
And puts it in the vault and calls it gold?
Yes.
Since that's completely circular, it's nonsense. It's just a fiction.
It's total nonsense. It's a pure accounting fiction. But it allowed them to massively expand the money supply. Because for every 100 marks of this paper gold they put in the vault, they could legally print 300 marks of regular currency to pay for the war.
So they were just creating money based on debt that was backed by what? Nothing. Really.
Just the hope, the bet that Germany would win the war, conquer other nations, and use their resources to pay it all back.
It's financial alchemy.
Yeah.
They kept the veneer of the gold standard, the illusion of soundness, while actually moving to a fiat currency without anyone noticing until it was way too late.
And notice the fundamental shift in what money is. The money in Arthur's pocket before the war, the sovereign, was an asset. It was wealth. It had intrinsic value.
Right.
The money created in the Darlingskassen system is a debt. It's a claim on future taxation. The population of Germany and eventually all the combatants were convinced, through patriotism, to trade their real tangible wealth for receipts of their government's debt.
And when the war ends and that debt can't be paid,
you get the Weimar hyperinflation. You get the total destruction of the German middle class. You get the conditions for everything that came next in the 20th century.
But the banks
stayed open. They had successfully offloaded all their bad pre-war loans into this massive war machine, and the public ended up holding the workless bag. Yeah.
Just incredibly grim. But it explains so much about the 20th century. It wasn't just a loss of life. It was a fundamental loss of value, a systemic theft, hiding in plain sight.
And it wasn't just the money that changed. This financing reset also dictated what that money was spent on. It shaped the physical world. And this brings us to the second major theme of our deep dive: energy.
This part is fascinating to me because I'm a bit of a tech geek. We usually think of WWI technology as, tanks, chemical gas, maybe the early airplane. Yeah. But there was a battle going on behind the scenes regarding the grid itself. The actual infrastructure of how we power our world was being laid down right in the middle of this chaos.
And it was being decided not by the best engineers, but by the people writing the checks.
Another personal account. This one comes from the diaries of a man named Elias. He was a brilliant young electrical engineer. In 1916, he found himself in the Signal Corps on the Western Front.
Okay.
Now, Elias wasn't your typical soldier. He was a devotee of Nikola Tesla. He carried a worn-out notebook in his tunic that was filled with sketches of wireless power Earth resonance. The whole dream of a world where energy was as free and available as the air we breathe. He truly believed that was the future.
An idealist.
A complete idealist. But then he looked around him at the reality of the war. He saw the endless convoys of coal trucks churning up the mud. He saw the thousands of oil drums being unloaded at the ports. He saw the endless heavy copper cables being laid through the mud of Verdun to power the field telephones and the command centers.
The brute force approach to energy.
Exactly. He realized that this war was a massive industrial project. And he noticed something else. The equipment, the copper, the rubber, the oil. It was all coming from companies financed by the same small group of banks, specifically the networks revolving around J.P. Morgan. Elias wrote about this growing sense of disillusionment. He realized that the war wasn't just killing people, it was killing a specific future. He saw the energy of the future, Tesla's dream, being literally buried in the mud to make way for a world of wires and bills and meters. He said, "We are building a cage of copper." He realized that if the war was won with oil and copper, the peace would be built on oil and copper.
A cage of copper. And Elias was spotting something very, very real. There was a direct conflict of interest between the technology of Nikola Tesla and the entire business model of JP Morgan.
I always hear about the Tesla versus Morgan fallout. But is it really that simple? Morgan backed Tesla initially, right? He gave him the $150,000 to the Wardenclyffe Tower. That was a lot of money back then.
It was a huge investment. Yeah. But you have to understand who JP Morgan was. He wasn't a venture capitalist in the modern sense, looking for the next cool app. He was an industrial monopolist. His power came from control. He controlled the copper mines. He controlled the rubber plantations. He was heavily invested in General Electric and the centralized utility companies.
So his entire empire, his whole net worth, is built on physical stuff. Stuff you can dig out of the ground, stuff you can measure, stuff you can transport, stuff you can sell by the foot or by the gallon.
Now look at Tesla. He's a peerless genius, but he has absolutely zero business sense. He's building this incredible tower out on Long Island. He tells Morgan it's for radio. "I'm going to send signals across the Atlantic." And Morgan thinks, "Great, I can charge for messages. That fits my business model. I can put a meter on that."
But that wasn't the real goal, was it?
That was just the cover story. The real goal was so much bigger. And this leads to the mysterious letter. Tesla runs out of money. He's getting desperate. And he decides to come clean to Morgan to tell him the whole truth, probably thinking Morgan will be blown away and give him more money.
Huge.
He writes a letter essentially saying, "Mr. Morgan, the radio is just the small stuff. This tower can transmit power. I can resonate the Earth's crust. I can power a light bulb in London from a generator in New York without a single wire."
And he thought Morgan would be happy about this.
Tesla was a scientist. He thought Morgan would see the humanitarian leap, the benefit to mankind. Morgan was a banker. He saw a complete catastrophe for his portfolio. There is this famous, though probably apocryphal, analysis of their relationship where Morgan essentially asks the ultimate capitalist question: if anyone can stick an antenna in the ground and get energy, where do I put the meter?
Last it always comes down to the meter, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can't charge a monthly subscription for the Earth's magnetic field.
If you can't meter it, you can't tax it. If you can't tax it, you can't build a debt structure around it. You can't issue bonds against the future revenue of free energy. It completely destroys the banking model that thrives on scarcity and control.
So where does the war fit into this? Why was 1913 the final nail in the coffin for Tesla's vision?
Because war is the ultimate accelerator of established technology. When the war started, governments needed guaranteed, off-the-shelf technology now. They needed millions of miles of copper wire for communications. They needed oil for the new dreadnought battleships. They needed coal for the trains.
They couldn't bet the entire war effort on some experimental resonance tower in Long Island.
Exactly. The war created a massive government-guaranteed demand for the metered paradigm. The banks Morgan's network included made absolute fortunes financing the extraction of copper and oil. They lent money to the mines, they lent money to the refineries, and then they lent money to the government to buy the final product. It was a perfect closed loop of profit.
So the infrastructure that we have today, the power lines hanging over our heads, the gas stations on every corner, the entire grid, it was all solidified during that 4-year period.
It was locked in. The capital expenditure was so massive that once the war was over, there was no going back. You aren't going to tear up millions of dollars of copper wire that you just laid to try a wireless experiment. We were committed. The path was set.
And what happened to poor Tesla?
Wardenclyffe was foreclosed on, and this is the most symbolic, most heartbreaking part of the whole story for me. In 1917, right as the U.S. is entering the war, the tower was demolished, torn down. And what did they do with it? They sold it for scrap. The metal from the tower that could have potentially given us free energy was likely melted down and turned into shell casings or copper wire for the trenches.
That is just, it's incredibly pressing. We literally cannibalized a possible future to pay for the war.
We treated a potential utopia for a high-interest energy paradigm. We built a world where energy is a commodity to be sold, not a right to be accessed. And that decision wasn't made by scientists or visionaries. It was made by the ledger.
This brings us to a really scary thought. If the people with the money can decide which technology wins and which one loses, surely they can decide which history gets written too.
If you control the present through finance and technology, you're definitely going to want to control how the past is remembered, because that's what justifies your position.
We have one final story in the stack, and I have to admit, this one is the most controversial. It deals with what some people call hidden history or gatekeeping.
But let's keep our critical thinking caps on for this one.
So this story comes from a woman describing her grandfather. He was an amateur historian living in Berlin after the war in the 1920s.
Okay, in the Weimar period.
Yes. He had found work cataloging ruins. You have to remember, Europe was just smashed to pieces. There were buildings destroyed that had stood for centuries. And amidst all that rubble, he claimed to have found anomalies.
Anomalies.
He found maps and architectural records that just didn't fit the official timeline of history. He believed he'd found evidence of a global civilization that existed just before the 19th century, one that was more technologically advanced than the history books admitted. He saw buildings and structures that he believed couldn't possibly have been built with the primitive technology of the 1700s. He tried to publish his findings. He tried to get funding to excavate further and prove his theories, but he hit a brick wall. Everywhere he went, he discovered that the funding bodies, the universities, the archaeological societies, the historical foundations, were all receiving their new endowments from the newly enriched financial institutions.
The same banks we've been talking about.
The very same ones. He was told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that if his findings didn't fit the approved timeline of linear progress, there was no money. He felt like he was becoming a gatekeeper of a lie. He realized that the same hands that funded the canons were now funding the history departments. Now I have to pause here, because this sounds a lot like the Tartaria internet theories, or the idea of mud floods, a hidden global civilization erased by a cabal of bankers. That sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie. Are we really saying there was a secret high-tech empire 200 years ago?
Look, I am very, very skeptical of the specific claims of Atlantis in the 1800s. The physical evidence for that is, well, let's just say it's thin.
Right.
But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. The mechanism that the grandfather describes, the gatekeeping, that is absolutely 100% real.
You mean the funding bias? The control of the narrative through money?
Forget the hidden civilization part for a second. Let's just look at the raw economics of academia after 1918. Who had the money? Who had all the capital?
The banks. We just established that.
The consolidation of wealth was staggering, on a scale we'd never seen before. In Britain, the banking system consolidated from 38 distinct banks into what they called the Big Five by 1920.
Okay.
In the U.S., J.P. Morgan & Co.'s assets more than doubled in just a few years. They went from around $550 million in 1913 to over $1.2 billion by 1919. That is an insane amount of leverage and power.
So they have all the chips on the table.
They have all the chips. And what do you do when you have that much money? You start setting up foundations to shape public opinion, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment, and so on. These foundations began to pour money into universities, libraries, and research grants. They became the primary source of funding for higher education.
And if you are a bank that just made $1 trillion in today's money on the industrial, scarcity-based model oil, coal, jet, metered energy, are you going to fund a historian who comes to you and says, hey, I have a theory that we used to have free energy and society was organized without central banks?
Oh, you're going to laugh him out of the room. You are going to fund the research that reinforces the status quo. You fund the history that says, we started as primitive savages, we invented capitalism and central banking, and now we are at the absolute peak of civilization. It validates your power structure.
So it's not necessarily a grand conspiracy of guys in a dark room burning books and hiding maps. It's just a filter, a financial filter.
It's a systemic filter. It's much more subtle and much more effective than a conspiracy. Ideas that threaten the debt-based model simply don't get the grant. They don't get the tenure track position at the university. They don't get published in the prestigious journals. Over 3 or 4 generations, that systemic bias shapes the entire consensus of reality.
History is written by the victors, is the old cliche.
But the deeper truth based on this is, history is written by the financiers of the victors.
That is a very sobering thought. We are looking at the world, at our own past, through a lens that was ground and polished by the very people who profited from the destruction of the old one.
And that brings us right back to the central idea of this whole deep dive, the reset.
Let's zoom out for a second. We started with a poster and a ledger. We saw a banking system on the absolute brink of collapse in 1913. We saw a war that conveniently allowed that system to break all the rules, suspend gold, and move to a fiat debt model. We saw the potential for wireless energy crushed by the need for metered war infrastructure financed by those same banks. And now we see a consolidation of financial power so total that it can effectively curate our own history.
The pattern is what matters. The sources call 1914 a reset. But if you look closely, you see that same pattern repeating over and over again. 2008 was a perfect reset. The banks gambled on subprime mortgages. The system went bust. What happened? Emergency. The rules are suspended. The public bails out the private losses. And the big banks emerge bigger and more powerful than ever.
Another emergency.
The economy's locked down. Small businesses are crushed. There's a massive transfer of wealth to the largest corporations. And the money printer goes brr on a scale we've never seen.
It's the same playbook.
It is the exact same playbook, just with different actors and a different crisis as the excuse. In every single case, you have a crisis, real or manufactured. The normal rules are suspended in the name of safety, private losses are transferred to the public ledger, and when the dust finally settles, the financial institutions at the top of the pyramid are more powerful than they were before.
We look back at Arthur the clerk, Elias the engineer, and the historian in Berlin as casualties of a system they couldn't quite see. But the financial machinery that was installed in 1914, the Federal Reserve, the fiat currency, the debt-based leverage, didn't end with the armistice. It became the architecture of the modern world. The next chapter in this pattern isn't history. It's being written right now, and this time the ledger includes us all.